Yeah, that's easy to do. I was looking for work. I just graduated from social work school, and also I had a degree from. I was getting a degree from McCormick Seminary down in Chicago, and um, Ralph said, "You know, they're looking for the director of Port St. Vincent de Paul," and I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, it's about 2 blocks away. Why don't you apply and go check it out?" I said, "Okay." So I had several applications into Presbyterian churches. I had been interviewing for a social work position in the Milwaukee area, and I went down to visit the port. And the person that interviewed me right in the very beginning was Mike Nunn. And Mike, if you didn't know him, was not the most smooth person ever. He was awkward. But there was a sincerity about him that was really quite amazing. And he then, I think I interviewed with the entire board, but it was mostly because of Mike that I said yes. A guy named Gary McGorry was there before me, and we had about a week together. And Gary ended up being instrumental in helping the port move out of the John Key's sort of way of doing things into a more ordered environment. John really ran it as kind of, as near as I could make out, and this is just my opinion, as his own fiefdom. And so, which was fine, but sometimes you didn't quite know what was happening there. And Gary brought some order to the place. He, right in the very beginning, the city of Madison was doing welfare, and so he got vouchers from the city of Madison to pay for people. So it would come to the port, it wouldn't come to the person. And that really helped stabilize some of the finances of the place. But I said yes, and then I started to learn about the society and was very impressed with both what St. Vincent de Paul said, which was, and I can't quite remember the exact thing, but it's basically the poor are exacting masters, and you'll need to accept the fact that they can forgive you for the bread that you give them. That was hugely important. And John's whole viewpoint about respect, but that really got epitomized by two people. One was, right from the beginning, this woman named Eunice Devine took me out for lunch at a lunch place, and she said, "So what do you want?" And I said, "Well, Eunice, I'm happy to have lox and bagels." It's the old Ella's Deli. And she said, "No, Glenn, what dessert do you want?" I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, we eat dessert first because life is too short." I went, "Okay." And then she proceeded to tell me, and she was from Queen of Peace. She and her husband were from Queen of Peace. Lovely people. She proceeded to tell me that she was going to make sure that Queen of Peace bought a shirt for each of the men, a flannel shirt for each of the men at the port. So that because she believed, at Christmas time, because she believed that everyone should open a wrapped gift up at Christmas. And all I had to do was come up with how many people were medium or large or extra large or extra extra large, or if there were some extra 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 large people. So that was number one. I just felt like, holy buckets, this is just incredible. The second person was a guy named Bob Kelter. And Bob was a social worker at the VA hospital. And he had been influenced by John Keyes. And Bob took me aside one day and said, "You know, there are people who suffer from mental illness here." I said, yeah, I know." He said, "And I know you're a social worker." I said, yeah, I am." He said, "I just want you to know one thing. They probably never told you in social work. school. And I said, well, what's that, Bob? And he said, these people are in pain. And they became people who suffered from mental illness, not people with mental illness. And it changed my whole perspective on how to treat people, which then dovetailed with John's whole idea of respect. And if you respect people, they will respect you. And if they respect you, you can respect people. And there's kind of this covenant that happens. And it took me a while to really plumb the depths of that. But the lessons that I learned from that are this. Number one, the men at the port and I are similar. We were similar. We liked the Packers, we liked the Bucks, we could talk baseball with the Brewers, we could do all sorts of stuff together and get along and tell jokes and play cards and do all sorts of stuff because we were similar. And I had some incredible card games at that place. Euchre as well as cribbage, for the most part. And the second thing I learned was that I was different from the men at the port. And the difference was that I grew up in an intact family. I had an intact family. I had enough money coming in to be able to afford housing. I had good relationships. And these men came in from broken relationships for the most part, or something major had happened to them. And we were different. And that was okay, because that was their story and this was my story. And then the third thing I realized is what happened to them mattered to me. And what happened to me mattered to them. When my children were born, they celebrated. When they got a job, I celebrated. When they were able to start paying rent after a while, then they could move on, and we celebrated that. And sometimes we celebrated. I'll never forget the day that Jack Donovan, who was had the most clobbered by mental illness. He had to leave the port because he had said some words that were just not within that covenant. To Art Olson, who I don't understand, but he called Art a vile name. And I knew enough about mental illness at that point to call his CSP, community support program, and to say, I think Jack needs to leave. And so Jack got up at our goodbye party and said, and I can almost quote it, he said, it's been wonderful being here, but this place only prepares you to go on for the next place. And it's now my time, but your time will come. And so I just want you to know that this is a really good place. And sat down. That was the most words I'd ever heard out of Jack's mouth. That was the clearest I'd ever heard him. He was mostly in his own world. But that has stuck with me. And it's not like there weren't people there at the port. And I'm sorry I continued to babble a little bit. But it's not like there are people in the port that were just incredibly wonderful. There were some people that were not very nice. But I also found that when I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, there were people there that were not very nice. And then in Winnetka, I found people that were really quite nice. And then at the port, there were people like Roger Mann, who died at the port, by the way, and I'll get to that story. But Roger Mann, who was the most welcoming presence I'd ever met in my life. I would take people in and orient them as best I could and have them sign the rules. And really, there was only one rule, which was, don't drink. Don't drink. And John Keyes would phrased it this: if you have enough money for alcohol or drugs, you have too much money to stay here. So if people came in inebriated, we would ask them to leave the next day or that night, depending. Roger would take whoever came in and then give them the kind of lowdown, like, you got to watch out for this guy. You got to make sure that you're here for the meals at the mealtime, or if you need to have a meal saved, you got to call in. And he would just give them that sort of enculturation of the place, how the place really worked as far as he was concerned, but so warm, so welcoming to people. So we had not just people that were members of the staff, but we had people who got what the port was all about, creating a family-like atmosphere there. And it was just an incredible place for me, for 16 years, a place of learning, not just about the men, but also about myself. Yeah, one of those is Roger's man's death, and was the first time the VA. Roger was had been a Navy in the Navy, and he was apparently, when he came out of the Navy, he was just an absolute terror. I'd use another term, but we're being nice here. And he was rejected by his family. The family just said, we can't handle you. So Roger ended up with not a whole lot of money, and ended up coming to the port after a while. And he had a big sort of cauliflower of cancer on his neck, which he thought he had got by nicking himself shaving, and it was not true. But so Roger had burned a lot of bridges, and he ended up being the first person that the VA hospital hospice, mobile hospice group serviced. And he was up in room number 3 at the time. And they came in and they gave him, everything that they need, that hospice does, a commode. They gave him all this stuff. And just to show you how Roger really wormed his way into other people's hearts. At one point, and he was down significantly to maybe about 90 pounds, very skeletal, came out of his room and got down the stairs of the port, and people made a bed for him on the couch. And that's where he stayed for the last maybe week, maybe 2 weeks of his life, with people coming in and talking with him and caring for him. The hospice people realizing that they had to switch everything around, and now he was on the couch, and so they brought in all the, the airflow mattresses and all that kind of stuff. And Roger died at the port. Now, Paul Ash has a lot more stories about Roger's death than I do, but what I remember about that is that it was just a really holy moment. People in tears because Roger died, but also the warmth and the love at the port. That's one sort of milestone. The other milestone comes from St. Mary Goretti decided to have a giving tree for the port. And there's several great stories about this, but one of them was that there was a guy, and I never kicked anybody out before Christmas. It was sort of like my unwritten rule that even if they had bad behavior, I would try to figure out a way to keep them at the port during right before Christmas, because I wanted them to get gifts. And this one young man who's 25 years old just was unpleasant. So I asked him to leave. And but I said to him, but come back after Christmas because I hope to have a gift here for you. So, we gave out the gifts at Christmas time, and he did not come back. And it was after Epiphany, and he was not back. And I was getting down to maybe 1 or 2 gifts in the very back room, and he finally showed up. And I said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so happy that you're here. How are you doing?" He said, "Yeah, that was probably a really good thing that you kicked me out because I wasn't doing so well, and now I'm doing pretty well. I have a job and I have a place to stay." And I said, "Great." I said, "I have a gift for you." So I went to the back, and I said, "How big are you?" He said, "Extra large." So I had one gift left. It was extra large wrapped gift. So I had no idea what was in it. I gave it to this guy, and he unwrapped the gift, and he started to cry. And this is a guy who, from the age of 15 to 25, had been out of prison for about 3 or 4 months total through that time. I said, "You're crying." He said, "Yeah, how did you know?" I said, "What do you mean, how did I know?" And he said, "These are my colors." I said, "These are your colors?" He said, "Yeah." And I looked at the shirt, and the shirt was a checkered black and white flannel shirt that somehow had found its way into his heart from the generosity of people who had given. We never know how we're going to touch people. Getting back to St. Mary Goretti and the amount of gifts that the guys got at Christmas time. They got underwear, and they got socks, and they got hats, and they got, did I say socks already? They got winter coats, and they got gloves. Some actually got pants. So, I mean, just all this stuff that came in from St. Maria Goretti, as well as Queen of Peace. So, but St. Maria Goretti at that point, and it was mounded in front. And I had my daughters there, and my daughters, because the guys at the port really didn't think that they should get gifts at Christmas time. They didn't feel like they were worthy to get gifts. And so you cannot say no to a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old daughter who comes and gives you a gift. You cannot say no to that child. So I started flinging stuff at them, because then they would have to catch it. And I'd say, what's your size? And so that's for you. And then I'd say, Molly, go take, Caitlin, go take, or Bridget, go take this over to that man over there. And the guys would then take the candy canes off and give it to my daughters. So, I mean, there was a mutual exchange of gifts, right? It was amazing to see the difference on a Christmas day when you're not with your loved ones and you're depressed and you're feeling bad about yourself, and the generosity of people who make that day even better, change the day for you. And the quick story about that is there's a guy named Albert there. It was a extra, extra, extra large. I came in and I said, "Merry Christmas," and he said, "There's nothing merry about this day." And I said, "Okay." And then we handed out gifts, and there was a winter coat that was extra, extra, extra large. And I said to my daughter, "Take that over to Albert." And she did, and he opened it up. And as we left, I said to Albert, "Merry Christmas." And he said, "Merry Christmas." And again, it's the change that happens. One more story about a major milestone. I had a pretty prominent, Presbyterian church, right? asked if they could come down and serve a meal down at the port. And I said, no. And they said, what? And I said, this is not the zoo tour. We're not here to see homeless people in their natural habitat. You'll need to come down at least 3 times. Because the first time, everybody's nervous. Second time, it's a little bit more familiar. And the third time, people generally have relaxed a little bit. So he said, okay. So he brought the confirmation kids down 3 times. I can't remember if it's 3 weeks in a row. I think it was 3 weeks in a row. And, you have to deal with kids' schedules and everything else, and it was all a mishmash. But this kid, this young man, I think he was about 15 at the time, sat next to a guy named Cliff. And he said to Cliff something pretty insulting, actually. He said, so how did you get referred here? He didn't know any better. He's 15 years old. He's trying to make conversation. Give him credit, but still a little bit, not so good. And Cliff looked at him and said, hi, my name is Cliff. What's yours? And the kid mumbled his name, which was Peter. And Cliff said, I think what you want to know is this, like, who am I? And I want you to know 3 things about me. Number 1, I graduated high school. Number 2, in the midst of my senior year, I had an onset of mental illness. And number 3, I started drinking in order to dumb down those effects that was having on me. So I became an alcoholic. So, do you know what an alcoholic means? And the kid went, yeah, I think I know what that means. He said, well, I'm now sober and I'm going to meetings. And number 2, my mental illness is such that it's being taken care of by medication. But do you know what it means to be a paranoid schizophrenic? And started to explain that to the kid because the kid had no idea. And when the kid was asked, what was the best thing about confirmation? What was the thing that was most impactful about his faith? He said, Cliff. Because it brought him out of his very cloistered life and realized that there are people, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say, there were people who suffered from both mental illness as well as alcoholism. So those are some of the things. I could tell you about Cliff Wood, who was a farmer that was the first person that was he was helped by a newly formed Dane County Department of Human Services unit called Elder Abuse. And he was brought off his farm because the people that he had hired to help him stay on his farm were not taking care of him. And he came into the port, and he was in bed 4, which was the one that had a wall to it, so he could feel safe. And he looked at me after Dennis McQuaid, the social worker at the time, got him all oriented, and Cliff looked at me and said, would you wash my feet? And I said, okay. And he couldn't bend down to wash his own feet. He couldn't actually, he could shower himself, but he couldn't wash all his body parts. And I said, okay. So I got a basin out, and I washed his feet, and I took off about an eighth of an inch of skin off of his feet. And I just kept thinking about foot washing and our tradition of foot washing. And what a beautiful little moment this is. And it was disgusting. Don't get me wrong. But it was beautiful as well. There's two things about that. Number one, when I was at the port, I would walk down State Street with my wife, and we'd be going to Canterbury bookstore or something like that. And I would say hello to people on the street. And as I said to my friends, they're not the most influential people in town. So I think one of the things that it helped me do is realize that people are people. And that some people need a hand up, not a hand out. And I know that's a trite phrase to say, but that really was true. And so when I see people on the street, I ask them their name. I don't look away from people. And sometimes I ask for their help. There was one time that I had a possibility of 3 different jobs. And there was a guy that was singing outside of Willie Street Co-op on Williamson Street. And I knew him from the port, and I can't remember his name right now, although I would tell you that. So I went up to him and I said, "Would you pray for me? Because I have these 3 different jobs and I don't really know which one to do." And he stopped everything right then and there, and he began to pray for me, holding my hand. So how to ask for gifts from people in order to continue to allow them to have some dignity in this world. So that's one thing. Not always being the one to give, but the one to get as well. The second thing that prepared me is to really prepare me for a heart of compassion. And my heart has been soft, but is now what's the phrase that Jesus uses? Innocent as doves and wise as serpents. So my no became my no at the port. And it hardened me in some ways. But my yes became my yes. So there was a guy that was on methadone who said, I'll pay you next month. I'll pay you next month. This happened like twice. And I went, the third time I went, "It's been nice having you here." And he was like, "What?" I said, "Well, you haven't paid me for 2 months. You've been very helpful around here. You've tried to ingratiate yourself around here. But bottom line, I'm not helping you. We're not helping you. I know that you can figure this out." And the second one was a guy that came in who was pretty urbanized and was talking very much street language. And I had been at Covenant House, so I understood some street language, and I'm not unfamiliar with that. And I looked at him and I said, "Listen, I don't think you're going to make it here, but I'm going to give you a chance. And I want you to prove me wrong. I want you to find yourself a job. I want you to be out of here in 2 months and feel good about yourself." Guy looked at me, said, "Okay." 3 months later, not 2 months, but 3 months later, he was gone. So my no became my no, and my yes became my yes, and I had to work against my prejudices. Right? Because we start to pigeonhole people when they come to us in a wholly different way. I think the word or phrase comes, the first word that comes is underrated. With Ralph's leadership and with the port, I think the story goes like this. When I asked to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church, there was a guy that was appointed to talk to me about a committee, because Presbyterians always work with committees. Came in and said to me, "Half of my people at my church would say, 'Glen, Steve, he doesn't function as a minister. You know, he doesn't do communion, he doesn't do any baptizing, he doesn't do any preaching, you know. And the other half would say, you know, Glen does more damn ministry in a week than you do on the golf course in a month. And which was true. And the society does all this work because of the genius of Frederick Ozanam, but mostly the genius of Rosalie Rondeau. Okay, it's always, you know, Frederick may get the, but Rosalie was really the person. Because of that, the society has done so much work for people who are not prominent. It's incredible the amount of work it does. And Ralph was the genius, and he really was, he is a genius in creating places of caring. And the port was one of those wonderful little places of caring. This is my favorite story. Is a guy comes into the port and he says to me, "Hey Glen, you remember me?" And this guy is built. I mean, you know, he's really quite, yeah. And I say, "Yeah, your name is Lee, and excuse me for a second." And I place myself between the front door and him because I want to be out the front door before he can lunge at me. I said, "Yeah, Lee, you were here 2 years ago and I asked you to leave because you're drinking." And he said, "Yep, that's right. You know what happened to me?" And I edged toward the door a little bit, you know, I must admit I was a little nervous there. And I said, "No, Lee, what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, that day you kicked me out, I sold my motorcycle, I bought a ticket to Phoenix, Arizona. I got hired by a radiator repair shop. I bought into that shop. I now own that shop. I now own my own house. And I run a 12-step program out of my house." I said, "Well, Lee, Merry Christmas." And you never know with your yes and your no. If you can really mean your no, then your yes means yes. But I had to draw the line with him, not just for Lee's sake, but for the port's sake. Not just for the port's sake, but for Lee's sake. Because we weren't going to help Lee unless we drew that line. We weren't going to be able to have the port be a safe place unless that line was drawn. And you have to do it in a respectful way, right? So my phrase became, "It's been nice having you here. You now have 2 hours to get your stuff together." And then people would start to argue and I'd say, "Well, you have an hour and 50 minutes now. You can stay for lunch, but right after lunch, you need to go." "Well, where am I going to go?" "You know, you found this place, you're going to find the next place. I believe in you." I began to write down the name of people that helped at the port. And one couldn't help but talk about Andy Piazza, who came into the port every single Wednesday and made pizza for the men at lunch, and soup, but made pizza for the men. And she didn't care what was there, she would just put it on the pizza. And she made her own dough. So I once asked her in August at some point, she came in, and she was an old farm woman. She was part of Cottage Grove Catholic Church. I'm forgetting what that name. St. Patrick's out in Cottage Grove. And I said, "Well, Ann, you know, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, you know, have you been doing anything?" Kind of laughing a little bit. And she said, "Yeah, you know, I went to morning mass, and yeah, I've canned 30 quarts of tomatoes." "And it's 9 o'clock in the morning, you've done all that?" She said, "Yeah, you know, how do you think I get the tomato sauce?" She canned her own tomatoes in order to make the tomato sauce. Mary McCool became part of the board after a while, but she and a woman that she was a nurse at St. Mary's, along with Peggy Weber, and a woman named Sally, and I can't quite remember Sally's last name, but Mary and Sally would come in every Tuesday to cook. As I said, Immaculate Heart of Mary and Joe Frisch, and my favorite woman, and I'm forgetting her name right now. It'll come to me. Betty Vetter would come in, and they were part of a group that came in once a month. And Betty's husband looked at her and said, "You're going down to Williamson Street, to the port? Aren't you afraid?" And Betty went, "Nah, the guys are just fine." Okay, I mean, we had some characters there. Dick Sorensen, I eventually hired as the breakfast cook, and Louis Lenzendorf, who was the breakfast cook there, had about 2 people that would come to breakfast. And Dick had about 20 people that came to breakfast, because he actually respected them enough to ask them what they wanted instead of giving them what he wanted to cook. And so he was a short order cook for 20 guys, and he loved it. We generally had bacon, we had eggs, he generally made home fries by himself. So, I mean, it was just an amazing thing. So again, 6 o'clock in the morning, I would not be there at that point, but 6 o'clock in the morning, Dick would be holding court and would sometimes get a little irascible and, as I like to say, color outside of the lines. But for the most part, he was just fine. And this was the only job that he had in his entire life that he really, really excelled at. We had some hardness at the port. We had some people who died by suicide at the port because of their mental illness. At one point, Dan Potter, who died by suicide, also took pictures, and I have one of his photos of a wildflower at my house. There's a guy that I have a picture of named Leroy Bull, who was deaf and a mute. I don't know if you can see this. But he ingratiated himself into the Willie Street Co-op, and would show up every morning and brush off of everything, and then became a stalker, and they couldn't pay him because he was on SSI, and he died at the port of a heart attack, and we didn't find him for 3 days because we respected his room enough that we opened up the door. We didn't see him on the ground. Yeah, so there's lots of stories like that. And when if you ever want to have a good 2 hours, I can give you all the names of the guys, including a guy named Richard Kruschke, who was a whole deal in and of himself.